Hello and welcome back to On the Hotplate. On the Hotplate is a video series with short reviews of what research is telling us concerning hot topics around food sustainability to help food service to make more informed decisions. My name is Will Nicholson. I'm the founder of Interfood. You can read more about Interfood at interfood.no. We use research and technology to help food service businesses to serve meals that are healthier, more sustainable and profitable. We use reporting and online learning to facilitate that process. Episode 2. Does it matter where your food comes from? Okay, where your food comes from or sourcing of your food is pretty complex. So the way to break it down is to look at different factors and consider them one by one and then get a better understanding. So we're going to look at a few factors here. Climate change, otherwise known as food miles, which has been kicking around as a concept for quite a few years now. Traceability, so understanding what happened on the farm, what are the ethics, are the certifications attached to that product, health factors of where your food has come from, and socio-economic factors. Okay, food miles. So this has been an idea that's been around for quite a long time, that the distance your food has travelled is a significant contribution to the climate change impacts or the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas emissions of that food. One thing we do at Interfood is we help companies to understand the carbon footprint of their recipes. So for example, here we've got a pork pasta dish and the left-hand column is an ultra local pork pasta dish. So you can see the pasta, the veg and the pork contribution in terms of climate change, so the carbon footprint of those ingredients within that recipe. So when it's ultra local, the pork is by miles the biggest impact. That's the left-hand column. The middle column, what we've done is we've calculated if all of those ingredients travelled an extra 1,000 kilometres by road. And that's the black section at the top of the column. So as you can see, if it's been transported by road, it doesn't make that much difference. However, on the right-hand side column, everything has come 1,000 kilometres air freighted. Now that makes a big difference. But what you can see as an overview of this dish is the contribution of the meat outweighs everything else. So in conclusion, road and boat is not so bad, but air freight is much more significant. But this is obviously relative to the recipe you've used. And in this case, there's a lot of meat in this recipe, so the meat is by far the biggest contribution. So if we step away from the meat factor a bit, here's an example. Some research that was done a while back looked at UK grown tomatoes that were grown in a greenhouse, a heated greenhouse, and then transported within the UK, compared them to Spanish tomatoes that were grown in unheated polytunnels and then transported by truck to the UK. Now what the research showed was that the Spanish tomatoes actually had a lower total carbon footprint than the UK tomatoes. It's just one simple example, and the reason was that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fossil fuel based production and the heating of the greenhouse outweighed the extra carbon footprint from transporting tomatoes from Spain. So production matters more normally. It's not always the case, but we can't use distance, we can't use transport as the metric of whether it's sustainable or not, certainly from a climate change perspective. If you want to dig around in some research, there's kind of a classic paper that's a few years old now. You can see the name of the paper here. I suggest you just Google that and get hold of it. Gives you a good overview. Right, let's talk about traceability. Certainly conceptually, it's easier to ask your local farmer about sustainability and ethics. That kind of feels like common sense, yeah? But really, what I'm interested in is what questions should you be asking? Do you know what to ask them about sustainability and ethics? Do you know how to tell whether they're producing their food in a more sustainable way or not, or a more ethical way or not? If you don't, then the fact that it's a local farmer or not means you're basically taking their word for it. And I don't think you can really run your food service business in that way. So for example, Norwegian local meat. I've been based in Norway quite a lot, and there is a sort of a consensus in Norway that Norwegian meat is more sustainable than imported meat. Some of this is very much cultural. However, there is, for example, good evidence to show that the Norwegian livestock system uses less antibiotics than a lot of other countries. So in Norway, if you're buying Norwegian meat, the fact that it's local is not that important, but the fact that it's using fewer antibiotics, I think we could argue that that's important. And you can make the same arguments about animal welfare and so on. So what we're saying here, actually, the local bit is irrelevant. It's about the governance. Now, with technology coming in the future that gives us more traceability across longer and more complex supply chains, it may well be possible for us to apply the same intelligence to much more complex supply chains. So if you've got governance that can verify that the food that you're importing that's traveled quite a long distance has been produced sustainably by whatever certifications you're interested in, then it ceases to be that relevant where it's come from. It's not about the sourcing and where it's come from, it's about the governance. And it's about our ability to trust that governance. Okay, health. There is some evidence for freshness with shorter supply chains. So especially with fresh fruit and veg, the shorter they're travelled, the healthier, or the more nutrient rich, vitamin rich, etc. They tend to be, and there's an argument for that. It gets a bit complicated when it comes to frozen produce. There are arguments that frozen produce can actually be healthier, etc., etc. It's a bit of a minefield. This is the way to look at it. We need to see this within the bigger picture for a balanced diet. So if you're buying all your food on short supply chains, yes, per item it might be a bit more healthy, but if you're not eating a healthy balanced diet, or in food service terms you're not serving healthy, balanced, sustainable meals, then the short supply chain thing becomes a bit irrelevant. It's about the balance of the food that we're actually eating on a wider perspective than just a product by product basis. Socioeconomic, there's a strong argument for supporting your community. Don't think any of us would really argue against that, but I think there's also an argument for supporting someone else's community. We live in a global world. Things are much more interconnected nowadays. Comes back to governance. If you know that the produce you're buying from another country is supporting farmers, it's produced sustainably, the money's going into that economy, is that any different to supporting your own community? However, we're increasingly becoming an urban population across the world, and I think there is definitely a point here about ultra-local urban farming being a good use of space within your community to produce food. So what really matters? Well, the mode of transport obviously matters more than the distance travelled. Go for governance rather than localism. And technology is going to increasingly help us to understand the governance of food that's come on longer and more complex supply chains. Doesn't mean stop supporting your local farmers. Absolutely not making that point, because the role of food culture and identity also matters. If you want to get an overview of this, the link at the bottom here, if you Google that, it's quite a good recent piece of research that covers this. They make exactly the point I'm trying to make here, that distance isn't an indicator of sustainability, but governance is a much better indicator. So that's where we should be focusing. We need to understand more about our supply chains and their impacts. And then where your food comes from matters within the context of the governance around that food production. If you want to learn more about this sort of stuff, come to the School of Sustainable Food Service. It's an online learning platform for chefs and food service professionals. You can find it at skillsthatsavetheworld.teachable.com. You can literally go on, pay with your credit card, start learning. Short, flexible videos focused on sustainable food service. If you want a group booking, get in touch with us at interfood.no to find out more about that. That's the end of this week's episode. Hope it's been useful.